The next assembly we're going to discuss is the flomatic model DCV and DCVE. This is their double check assembly, produced in sizes 3/4 through 10 inch. In the small sizes 3/4 through 2, it is a bronze body unit. In the 2.5 through 10 inch, it is a ductile iron body with a fused epoxy coating. The standard unit is a bronze, as I said, but they also have a DCVE, which is an enviro bronze, which is a non-leaded bronze alloy, used in areas where lead is a concern, as it's starting to become in 2010. And it's been on the market for about 3-4 years in the environmental brass version, and is also available. And we're going to combine the double check with their RP version, because the checks are the same in the double check as they are in the RP. But the RP model is a model RPZ. There's also a model RPZ Roman numeral 2. RPZ and RPZ2 are small sizes, 3/2 through 2 inch. The RPZ is the first production. The RPZ Roman numeral 2 was a modification of a downsized body, which we'll discuss when we take them apart. And also is an RPZE, which is like the double check, is the environmental bronze version. And again, the environmental bronze version is a non-leaded bronze alloy that was produced in the small sizes, meaning 1/2 through 2. They also produce the large units, the large meaning 2.5 through 10, in a ductile iron body that is fused epoxy coated. Showing a schematic of the small size in the 1/2 through 2 inch sizes, double check and RP have the same check configuration. It's an inline check design, single access cover from the top. You can see the checks are held in by a small little spring clip, and on the RP version the relief valve sits through the middle. If that was a double check, obviously there would be no relief valve stem in there. And here's an enlarged breakdown of the relief valve stem assembly in the RP, RPZ, RPZ2, and RPZE. And here's a schematic of the check valve on the small sizes, again 1/2 through 2 inch. The 2.5 through 10 inch is very similar looking to the small sizes, where it's an inline check design, single access cover on the top. Relief valve stem sits between the two checks on the RP version. Double check version obviously would not have the relief valve stem like this. The checks are also held in by a clip design similar to the small ones. Obviously just a little bit bigger in construction, taking it apart, and the relief valve comes out through the top, also very similar to the small one, except larger in size. So let's go ahead and take the DCV and the RPZ series apart and take a look and see what they look like. Here's what the small sizes look like in the RPZ reduced pressure assembly and the DCV double check series. As I said earlier, they had Roman numeral 2s for the downsized assemblies. They were the same basic construction, and repair techniques were the same. Rubber kits were different. And they have the E version, which was the environmental brass, which was a non-leaded brass, which repair parts, again, were the same, but the materials that the body was made of were different. So we're going to go ahead and take the reduced pressure apart, since it has the same check mechanism as the double check. Let's take a look at the model RPZ. This is the 3/4 inch, the original version, non-enviro brass and non-Roman numeral 2. Obviously we have a cutaway here, so you can see the stem in the middle. You can see our first check assembly and second check assembly here like this. And inlet side here, outlet over here. Here is the cover bolts on the top. Removing the bolts, there will be spring tension from the top from the relief valve spring. So cover comes off in one piece, relief valve stem comes out in piece, relief valve spring, and the relief valve seat, which is in the bottom, comes out from the bottom. The check assemblies are held in by these spring clips. And I've got a check assembly loose here without the clip. Take that out first to show you what it looks like. But that's what the check assembly looks like inside the body. It's sealed by an O-ring, which isn't there, and it's an inline check design. But to remove the check, you can see here the clip that holds that in place. The clip is a spring clip. It's a pair of lineman's pliers. Grab it, release it, pull it out, and the check assembly will come out in one piece. Again, there's the O-ring you can see on the first check. So those are the parts. They're an inline check design, held in by a separate clip for each check. There's several other similar designs like this on the market, where they have an inline check design with the relief valve through the center, but those all have a single retainer. This one has a separate retainer for each check valve. Anyway, to rebuild the check mechanisms, the bolt head here holding that, unscrewing the disc holder, comes off in one piece like this. There's my check seat, spring, stem, and here's my relief valve disc, check disc. To change my check disc, just replace it like that. Reassembly is going to be just the reverse, like that. has to be tight. Wrench, tightening up those, replacing the O-rings. Now, that's the first check, and that's the first check, and then that's the second check in the bodies like this. You can see the O-ring on the first check, second check I'm missing that O-ring. Next would be the relief valve stem, which sits in the middle like this. And again, it's guided from the top and the bottom. There is a cover where this O-ring sits inside here and guides the relief valve through its travels like this. So you can see on the cutaway back and forth. It's also guided on the lower portion through the relief valve seat. So it's an upper and a lower guided stem. To take the stem, another thing that's important on this is to look through the center of that stem. You'll notice that there is a hole. You can see I move my finger back and forth. So there's a breather hole that goes all the way through the stem. What that's for is it sits in the body like this. As the relief valve stem moves up and down, on this side of the O-ring is open to water, but above the O-ring is open to air. So as the stem moves up and down, there has to be a place for that air to go. Many of the other similar assemblies like this have a hole in the top of the cover, and as it moves up and down, it breathes through that breather hole. The flomatic design has a hole that goes right through the center of the stem, so as the stem goes up and down, the air comes out from the bottom of the stem. So that's why there's a hole in the very center of the stem, right there. See if I can find it again. Anyway, you saw it the last time. Reassembling the stem. Unscrewing the guide will remove the relief valve disc. Replacing the relief valve disc is going to be just the reverse, new disc. And our guide, which holds the disc into the disc holder, tighten it down. On the top we have our stem, our guide O-ring, which is very important that it's lubricated properly, because remember the top half is open to atmosphere, there's no water up here, it's only the bottom half. Unscrewing the relief valve stem from the top, we'll release our relief valve diaphragm. Repair it, just the reverse, replacing our diaphragm, making sure this retainer is very tight because we have to facilitate a water seal across that diaphragm. Reassembly now, we're going to go ahead and put our first check in. Take our clip and grabbing the clip from the outside, going to get it in place. And then the clip will sit in like that. It's actually sprung in there, and the best way to get it out is with a pair of lineman's pliers. Channel lock sometimes gets in there kind of hard. It's easier to get from the top with the lineman plier. Anyway, second check. I don't have the clip for that or the O-ring, but that's just there for demonstration. Reinstalling the relief valve. We're going to start putting our relief valve seat in. Again, pressing the bottom, relief valve spring on top. Relief valve stem goes through the spring and between the check valves. High pressure sensing line is internal, so that means we have the hole through the diaphragm that has to line up with one of our bolts. As always, it's best to put all the bolts in all the way around the relief valve because it helps line it up and center it. It also makes sure we don't bend the diaphragm in any way. Anyway, getting the relief valve stem in place. Next, through the guide, through the stem. Like that. Get our bolts caught. And that's a 3/4 model RPZ, the 3/4 DCV double check, and that's what the smaller versions, 3/4 through 2 inch, look like, and it's going to be for average repair. The 3/4 through 2, we took that one apart, and a lot of people get scared when they see something larger sizes, and here is the parts from a 4-inch flomatic RPZ. Again, same relief valve stem as you can see. Unscrewing the guide removes the relief valve disc. Same cover on the top with the guide O-ring. Same thing, the stem unscrews to change the relief valve diaphragm. Although it is much, much bigger as a 4-inch versus a 3/4, it is the exact same repair procedure. Check valves are a little different only because they're so much bigger. Held in by a clip, which is a much bigger clip than you saw on the 3/4. Actually, the bigger clips are easier to get in and out because you can get your hand around them opening up. But once you get this check assemblies out, the spring is contained for the repair. Here's the first check, and here's a second check right here. Best thing to do is placing it in a vise, and once it's in a vise, the check disc can be unscrewed. One disc holder, disc retainer. Disc sits in the holder like this. Reassembly is going to be just the reverse. Reassembling it, having it on a vise, it actually just threads down, and you end up tightening the stem into there so that it doesn't damage the seat as you're turning it down, turning the stem in and turning the stem out. Anyway, whether it's the small 3/4 or this being a 4-inch and all the way up to 10-inch that they make, the repair techniques are the same. O-ring seal, large clip that holds it on the larger sizes versus the small ones, but the repair technique will be exactly the same. And that's our Flomatic DCV and RPZ series, from sizes 1/2 inch on the small side all the way up to 10-inch. The next assembly we're going to discuss is the Flomatic pressure vacuum breaker series called the model PVB. PVB is produced in sizes 3/4 through 1-inch. Production began around 1995-ish, and it's a bronze body unit. They do not have an Enviro bronze body version of this unit, only the brass body. Here's a picture of what the assembly looks like. Test cocks are mounted on the ball valve, which a lot of them are starting to do on the pressure vacuum breakers, which means we have to be careful if we ever have to change the shutoffs to make sure we put a tapped ball valve on, and we make sure we have the test cock on the right side of the ball. Here's a schematic of the assembly. Air inlet on the top, check assembly underneath it. Let's go ahead and take it apart and see what it looks like. Here's the Flomatic pressure vacuum breaker model PVB, again produced in sizes 3/4 and 1-inch. Screws hold the cover on top. Once the cover is off, the bonnet unscrews from the top. It is sealed by an O-ring. Now, once we get the air inlet apart, the bonnet, there's the poppet, and there's the air inlet spring. Inside the check assembly, you'll notice that it looks like it's almost like a hex wrench sticks in there. But what we need to do at this point is to get a special socket. We need a 12-point, 1 3/8 inch socket and an extension bar to get in there, because the check assembly unscrews from the check assembly. And as you can see here, that 12-point has to go around because it has to be a very small wall in there to get inside that check assembly. But the socket goes around it, unscrews the check assembly is sealed by an O-ring. One screw holds the spring tension of the check assembly together. Disassemble like this. Check assembly, check disc comes out of the holder, stretch that out, new disc holder inside. Reassembly is going to be just the reverse. And again, sealed with an O-ring. And that 12-point, 1 3/8 inch socket thin wall is very important. If you have a 12-point thick wall, it may not fit exactly on there, so that check assembly goes back together like that. Reassemble this screw like that. Long screw. Then with your sockets, you can go ahead and put it in from the top. So you can see outside what you're looking at from the top, but you see the hex underneath. So the socket has to go over it, putting it in place, and also in tightening it. Putting it in, you get it started by hand, and once you get in place, tightening it with the socket. So getting it started by hand, like that. Then your socket on top, to go ahead and tighten that down. It's an O-ring seal, so it doesn't have to be overly tight. Once you have the check assembly in there tight, then the air inlet goes on next. Bonnet assembly, air inlet, pop it. Again, O-ring seal. Again, with an O-ring seal, we don't have to have that overly tight. Canopy on top. That's our pressure vacuum breaker from the model Flomatic model PVB in sizes 3/4 and 1-inch. The next assembly we're going to discuss is the Grinnell series, models B1 and B2 in sizes 4 through 10-inch, and the Kennedy model 1373. As it says on this page, see Grinnell B1, B2. Kennedy Valve Company was actually the manufacturer of this unit, but the majority of them were sold under the Grinnell name. And the Grinnell was a fire sprinkler company that had a lot of pipe valves and fittings they sold as a supply house. Grinnell Supplies, and they were selling a lot of double checks for fire systems, and rather than buy standard stuff on the market, they arranged a private label agreement with Kennedy to sell their double check as the Grinnell model B1 and B2. Majority of them were under the Grinnell name, but you may see some under the Kennedy 1373 designation. The original B1 and B2, there was a slight change in the seat and the outer end dimensions of the valve to make way for UL approvals on that, so that's why the B2 is a little bit different than the B1 Basically, the change went from from a flat seat to a beveled seat, and they did extend the body slightly for flow characteristic reasons. Here's what a picture would look like. Top covers from the top for access for the check valves. It did have a handle on top, which was kind of useful when you were repairing it. Inlet side here on the right, outlet on the left, and important thing was this little plug right there. The plug had to be removed to get the access to the check assemblies. This was, a lot of them were sold, but why it was taken out, you won't see too many anymore, is this was a weight-loaded double check, and you can see the outline of the weight right there. The trouble with the weight, it was a solid chunk of lead that was exposed in the water passageway. So a lot of people had trouble with it with the lead and copper rule, and replaced most of them because of that exposed lead. There are still some out there. Here's a close-up of that beveled seat that they went to in the B2 designation. Again, changing it from the flat seat to the beveled seat and extending the length of the body for requirements for flow characteristics. But anyway, the single plug on the outside, the cover had to be removed, drive the pin, check mechanism would come out from the top. Let's go ahead and see what the check mechanism looks like outside of the body. Here's what the check mechanism on a 4-inch looks like outside of the body. You can see the pin that slides through here on that bolt cover on the body, but you can see where my hand right here, that's a solid chunk of exposed lead in the water passageway. Anyway, once you drove the pin out and got the weight mechanism out, and you can see a very heavy weight mechanism, there was one bolt that holds the disc into the disc holder, changing the disc. There was also a rear nut back here, and a small O-ring on the check stem. You can see as this stem goes through the disc holder, there had to be an O-ring to seal it, and there's where that stem O-ring sits right there. The assembly is going to be just the reverse, replacing the stem O-ring. Castle nut on the top. That had to be tight, but notice it still had room for wobble, that way that the check assembly the disc holder would line up on the seat. One disc retainer, same castle nut type mechanism. Cotter key would sit through the hole in right there. And that's the check mechanism out of the Grinnell series, also known as the Kennedy series. This is a 4-inch. They made them 4, 6, 8, and 10-inch. Solid chunk of exposed lead in the water passageway. Anybody with lead issues should be aware of that. This is what the check mechanism looks like. Next assembly we're going to discuss is the Lawler series, DC for their double check assembly, which produced in sizes 3/4 through 10, and the model RZ for their reduced pressure principal assembly in sizes 3/4 through 10. They made the small sizes in 3/4 through 2 in a bronze body unit, single 2-axis on the checks and single axis for the relief valve cover, so 3 axes total. The 2.5 through 10-inch had a couple different bodies over the years. Galvanizing was one. They did have an epoxy coating towards the end of its production, but limited production on this assembly. Not a lot of them were sold on the West Coast. Majority were sold in the mid part of the country and East Coast. If you did see any of them at all, rubber parts are no longer available. 3/4 through 2-inch looked like this, with the covers from the top from the checks, relief valve mounted on the side of the body. The 2.5 through 10, here's the body here with the relief valve mounted underneath like this. Let's go ahead and take a look at the small 3/4 1-inch. As I say, parts are no longer available, but I want you to see what it looks like inside. Oh, one unique thing on the large size 2.5 through 10, on the check cover there was a plug, a 2-inch plug on the very top, and it was open to give you a visual inspection of the inside. The check springs were contained when the covers were removed, but they put a large plug that you could unscrew it and make sure that the bolt on the spring retainer was still in place, so that if you did take the cover off, at least you knew that the spring had come apart somehow inside the body. I like showing assemblies that may not be available anymore, but just to kind of get an idea of what they look like, because sometimes you're going to see things that look very similar. Here's a check mechanism that's very similar to another manufacturer's check design, and I'm going to show it to you how the check assembly works. Check spring, spring retainer, and disc holder comes out in one piece. So it sits inside the check assembly just like this. In other words, it's almost identical to the BAVCO model 805 check assembly that we saw in the 805 or the 835B series. Relief valve stem. On this one, I want to show you that also, because it looks very similar to another model that we've seen, or we'll see. And cover comes off from the top, diaphragm separate. And then stem assembly like this. with our disc holder and spring right here. Very similar to what we saw in the Watts 909 series. So I wanted to show it to you just to see it. No more rubber parts are available. If you do have to repair it, you're going to have to replace the assembly. That's the Lauder. This is the RZ series for RP reduced pressure principle, and the DC for the double check assembly.